Good morning, girls. It's lovely to see you this morning. And we're just going to continue our wonderful series, which is on the brave women of the Bible. And so far, we've had this wonderful time where we've been looking at different women. We've looked at Sarah, we've looked at her daughter-in-law, we've looked at Rebecca's daughter-in-laws. And today we come to this very interesting story. You know, if you look at Genesis chapter 38, it's the whole story of Joseph and what happens to Joseph. And you know, you get an insight into what life is like with this family. And then chapter 39, the story continues. But sandwiched in between that, in chapter 38, is this very interesting story about Tamar. And Tamar, it is just amazing that, you know, the Bible doesn't miss out on details like this. And, you know, and I'm so glad about that, because in Tamar, you know, you will be able to look at the story and think, you know, I actually see a little bit of myself in here. And I'm so glad that the Lord has included me in his great plan for the world. You know, Tamar is actually part of Jesus's genealogy. She must have been his great, I don't know how many great grandmothers that preceded him. Isn't that amazing? When you hear the story, you'll be amazed at how God has included her and other women and you and I in his great plan. Anyway, so today we're going to be looking at Tamar. And I can't tell you the story about Tamar unless I talk about Judah, because it's so interwoven. And so we kind of, just to summarize, the family have come back. Rachel has passed away. Leah is raising not only her own sons, she's also raising her sister sons, Joseph and Benjamin as well. And the family have settled there. And, you know, things aren't that great because, you know, we might move certain places, but actually, unless we choose to make decisions to change, then we take our old selves with us. And so what I thought we would look at is, although we're looking at the story of Tamar, we're going to look at lessons and key principles to learn from her life and from Judah's life. And one of the first ones I wanted to look at here is this little thing I want to say is, we can be living in the center of God's will. We can be living in the promised land, but with our old DNA. We can be into a new season of life, but we might have old thinking. And so this is where we find ourselves. You know, the family are all there and they're all being raised. And yet those jealousies that happened between Jacob and Esau, those jealousies that happened between Rachel and Leah are still being outworked in this family. And so Jacob hasn't learned his lesson. He's adoring these two boys, Joseph and Benjamin, because this was Rachel's children. And there's been this resentment that has grown up for years. So if you read chapter 37, you'll know all the story about Joseph. We're not going to go into that just now. But the family have lived, they're now living in this promised land, but they're still living with this old DNA. They're still living with this old kind of thinking. The jealousies have raised their head, the anger, the resentment, the favoritism, and it's causing so many problems. And so I just wanted to say to you, you know, remember, you know, the children we take on our journey with us, you know, the people that we're influencing. If you're a youth leader and whatever, whoever you're influencing in your world, remember that how you portray things is what they'll catch. So these children have caught on to that favoritism. You know, I'm sure Judah and them, they remember their mum and they remember the pain that she had, but they're now reliving the whole thing and they're resentful of Joseph. And so here's this family, they've moved locations, but their heads haven't moved locations. They're living in the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that's supposed to be the promised land that God is going to bless them abundantly from. But they are living in a place where things aren't that great. And, you know, so here we see this man called Judah. This is the fourth son. And, you know, we looked at his name when we looked at Leah, and his name means praise. And, you know, if you've been given a name called praise, you know, that's speaking wonderful things over your life. But this man called praise, if you look at chapter 37, he's the one that decides that he's going to become a slave trader. You know, he looks at his brother and thinks, you know, I don't want him just to be stuck in a teach him a lesson and leave him in a pit and then bring him up the next day. I want to get rid of him. And he becomes a slave trader and he sells his brother. And then, one sin leads to another sin. Now what's he going to say? And the cover-up and the lies and the manipulation. So Judah has come back to his family and with all the brothers, and they've concocted this whole lie and story for his dad. And he's now watching the grief of his father. And I don't know if it was that caused him, but, Judah's not in a good place. And he's made a decision that actually got rid of the problem, and he thinks it's got rid of the problem forever, but God has other plans. And so that's one thing I'd like to say. Sometimes we move into new seasons, but when we move into new seasons, we need to actually check our minds, check our DNA. Are we ready for this season? And every new season needs new thinking, new plans, new ways of looking at things, putting on new glasses. And so that's what I would say for one of the lessons, one of the principles I wanted to learn. How can Judah, with his name meaning praise, how can it actually have gone so wrong? He is not God reliant anymore. He's self-reliant. He's fixing his own problems. He's solving his own issues. And another thing I wanted to say about Judah, the second principle I wanted to mention was, when you separate yourself from godly influences, you will see that things start falling apart. We all need fellowship. And I think this past season of lockdown, this pandemic has shown us that actually we can't do things on our own. I don't know, I have a coal fire, and I know I'm getting rid of my coal fire. But, I remember if you take a piece of coal away from the coal fire, it burns hot for a while, but unless it's surrounded by similar coals with a similar fire, that little piece of coal will actually eventually die, and the heat will go out of it and it'll become cold. We all need each other. And so Judah is with his family, but Judah has checked out. He's now watching his dad grieving, and he's like, you know what, I need to get away from this. And it goes on, in chapter 38 at the very beginning, it says, at about that time, Judah decided to separate from his brothers, and he hooked up with a man called Hira. So interesting. You want to do things on your own, and there's a man, there's a friend, there is a boat that goes somewhere, there is a provision made for you to actually walk away from the Lord. So anyways, he meets this man. And while he is with this man, while he is there, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite who was a daughter of Shua. It doesn't even give her name. She was just the daughter of Shua. Judah marries her. They went to bed together, and she becomes pregnant and had a son called She got pregnant again and had a son called Onan. And then she had another son, and she called him Shelah. They were living at Kezib, where she had him. And I just find this something, you walk away, think about it. Jonah decided to walk away from the Lord, and there just so happened to be a boat. When you walk away from the Lord, there will always be someone there to lead you and to help you on your journey of walking away. Be so aware. We need fellowship. We need each other. And so here we find, this guy Judah, who he knows that God has said to him, please find find someone of your own kin. Don't go and mix with the Canaanites. He's heard the stories, but he's taken himself away from his family influences, from his dad, from Leah warning him, and he's married a Canaanite woman. And so he's now living with the Canaanites, adopting all their practices. He's got 3 sons, and in a funny way, I've just realized I've got 2 different glasses, and I've been putting on 2 different glasses, but I hope that's okay. I'll stick with these ones. I've just realized that now. Anyways, so here we are. We find Judah, and Judah is with this Canaanite girl, and they have these 3 sons. I bet Judah was thinking to himself, I'm doing okay. I've seen what barrenness is like, so obviously I'm doing okay. Barrenness was seen as a problem, and it meant that you weren't walking with God, or God despised you or something. So he could actually almost comfort himself and think, you know what, I'm okay. I've got 3 sons, I'm doing well. Anyway, scroll on 16 years, and he has cushioned himself with the belief that everything is okay in his world. And him and his wife, they're living in Canaan with all the practices, and they decide, you know, we need to get a woman and for our firstborn. So their son is older, and they decide they will go and get a woman. He doesn't say to his wife, you know, let's go back and see who's living back home and let's marry someone else. No, he's quite happy to be led by his wife to go and look for a Canaanite. And this is where we find Tamar. And this is where he starts looking, you know, for not God's best, but, you know, God sees, and his will is sovereign over everything. God can supersede our mistakes. We can make mistakes, and God's will prevails. And, you know, although he was selecting Tamar, I believe God's hand was using him to select Tamar, because God had a different plan for Tamar. He had a different outlook for her, and we're going to see that just now. You know, we can live, another principle I'd like to say is we can sometimes live completely oblivious to God, but he sees everything, and God uses this situation to begin to unravel and to open up Mr. Judah's eyes. You know, this is a man called praise. When did he last praise the Lord? Whenever was praise in his lips? Has he ever thought about the Lord in these last few years that he's been living in Canaan? But God sees, and God is always looking to bring back the prodigal, to bring back someone. And so I don't know if Judah is aware of his son's evil ways, but, you know, God sees everything. And, you know, it says here that Judah and his wife, they went and got a girl called Tamar, and they married their first son off. It says in the Bible in verse 6, but Judah's son grievously offended God, and God took his life. We don't know what he did. It just says in the Bible he grievously offended God. This was a guy that had, you know, he had a wonderful heritage, but he was removed from his heritage. He was being raised by a Canaanite mom and a backslidden dad. And he grievously offended the Lord, and the Lord took his life. And then, you know, Judah has said, you know, well, actually, what we'll do is we'll marry you off to the next son. You know the story. Marries him off to the next son. And the next son, he's also grievously offended the Lord. He actually has taken the responsibility. He is taking his supposed responsibility of looking after his brother's seed by marrying Tamar. You know, we think it's a bit funny, but, you know, imagine marrying, if you lost your husband, you suddenly think you should marry his brother. But, you know, this isn't too far different. You know, I was researching that, you know, our present Queen Elizabeth, her grandmother, Queen Mary, in 1893 or something, her sister was engaged to be married to King George, and she died, and they didn't know what to do about it. And then they kind of looked at the sister and thought, you'll do. So Mary ended up marrying the crown prince. So it did happen in those days. It's happened just within a century within our own royal family. So you can imagine back hundreds and hundreds of years ago that this was what the practice was, to keep the seed going, to make sure that you had the inheritance and all the things that came with the first son. But, you know, this son also grievously offends God, because every time it says in the Bible, every time he slept with Tamar, he made sure that he came out before he completed intercourse, and his semen was spilled on the ground, and he wasn't able to produce a child for his brother. God was also much offended by what he did, and he also took his life. It's interesting, you know, God has taken the life of two of these boys, and yet Judah doesn't recognize that it is God, because he's so far away from the Lord. And so it's the unveiling of God has seen their sins, God has seen their lives, and he has taken both their lives. Judah doesn't think that there's a problem. He thinks, oh, I know what the problem is. The problem must be Tamar. So he takes Tamar, and he actually sends her away. And he sends her away to go back to live with her father. And he says, go and live there, and when my son Sheila is grown up, he'll come. Now, I don't believe that Sheila was a baby, because it says in the Bible the three boys were born quite close to each other. So I believe maybe Sheila was only 1 or 2 years away from being eligible to be married. But Judah has no intention of ever recalling Tamar. And she is sent away to live a shameful life because she hasn't produced heirs. They all think it's the woman's fault. She is a widow and she is barren. And so she's lived. And here's Judah again. The old nature has come. I've got rid of my brother, out of sight, out of mind. But God sees Joseph in Egypt. And he's done the same with Tamar, out of sight, out of mind. But God sees the situation. And Tamar is a lovely girl. Here she is. She is, totally taken advantage of this family. She's now back with her family. She's living in this, with her dad, longing. And she hears the jungle drums. People have said, oh, by the way, Sheila's eligible. He's running around with a bunch of girls. And she's thinking, I'm just waiting and waiting, keeping herself pure, keeping her side of the bargain, but waiting, and nothing happens. And we look at Judah, here he is, he's unsaved. Judah's wife is unsaved. Judah is backslidden. His sons are ungodly and evil and deceptive, and God has taken some of them. And Judah is practicing superstition. He's thinking that she's a bad omen. He is totally in denial, and he's trying to fix his own problems. The third thing I'd like to say is desperate people do desperate things. Let's not judge. We're very, very, very easy to judge. It's so easy to look at this and think, oh my goodness, I would never do this. But let's look at 2021. What happens when some people, are really in a desperate situation financially and think, well, I'll just buy that lottery ticket, or I'll steal from work, or they won't mind this, or they'll fall for a scam online. How many of us have fallen for scams online because we're desperate to make our lives a bit better? Or we you end up finding yourself pregnant and you think, what am I going to do? I'll just quickly go and have an abortion. Nobody will know, Or you neglect your marriage and then suddenly you find yourself, looking at someone else, and you find yourself going down this route of an affair, You look at young people who are struggling with their identity. They're rejected by their families. They find alternative lifestyles, alternative communities that'll accept them because they don't know what to do. They're in a desperate situation. They don't know how to do things. And I would say to all of us here, let's show more grace and less judging. Because, we all do desperate things. I know all of us in desperate situations will make desperate choices. And this is what happens in this story as well. So let's not judge them, because, God is a all-forgiving God. He sits above everything, and he can work his perfect plan. And so here we go. I just was going to say, how did this little boy that Leah gave birth to, that she said, wow, I'm going to call you praise. How did this little boy stray so far? And here we pick up the story, verse 12. Time passed. Judah's wife now dies. So Shua's daughter is now passed away, and Judah is now widowed himself. And when the time of mourning was over, Judah finds his old friend again, his friend called Hira. Remember I said, when you're in that vulnerable position, here comes that friend to lead you astray. And he finds his friend Hira, and he goes with him down to the place where they do the sheep shearing. And in a place where they do the sheep shearing, culturally, I'm not going to go into it, but it's a place where there was a lot of fun, there was partying and all sorts of things. And somebody has said to Tamar, hey, your father-in-law is going to that place. He's now on his own. He's going down there. And, Tamar's thinking, I have waited. I have kept my side of the bargain. What am I going to do? It says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 13, bad company corrupts good character. And we find that so closely here with Judah. And Judah hooks up with his old friend, and he goes down there and he decides, I've nothing to lose here. I failed as a brother. I failed as a son. I'm a prodigal. I failed as a husband. Well, my wife has died now, so I don't need to I failed in marrying the wrong type of wife in the first place. I failed as a father. My sons have been evil and deceitful. I failed as a father-in-law. I've let her go and I've just forgotten about her. And I've actually failed as a child of God. He's in a very, very vulnerable position, Judah. And when you are in a vulnerable, lonely position with very poor company, be very careful you don't walk off the path, because this is when we can become very, very vulnerable. You look at Jonah, you look at King Saul, you look at Ananias and Sapphira. The Bible is littered with stories of people who were going well, and then in that moment of weakness, in that moment of greed, that moment of vulnerability, they walked away from the Lord. You can run from God, but you can't hide from God. God is sovereign. And the other principle I want to say is God is sovereign, and he manages without our help. He manages well without us. But God sees everything. And there's Tamar. She's heard her father-in-law's going down. I don't know what idea came into her. Maybe she was led by the Lord, I believe. It could have been an idea she had, but anyways, I believe that whatever idea it was, God has superseded that, and he is part of that whole plan. She has gone down there and she decides, I'm going to take off my widow's clothes and I'm going to sit there on the road, and I'm going to watch as the men go by, and I hope to trap Judah. And the person who has been deceived, she is the one that's been deceived, is now going to become the deceiver. And so she has had a life of, she's been made fun of, she's been made a laughingstock by the second son, and now she's thinking, what, I've been taken advantage of, I'm just a commodity, I've been waiting and waiting and nothing's happened. So now she is going to set a plan and trap him. And so this is what we find, along comes Hira and Judah, and they're with all their friends, their entourage are coming into the city, and Judah is drawn to this girl that's veiled. And he goes along to her, and he must strike up some kind of a bargain. I don't know if she ever spoke, but he struck up some kind of a bargain, and he goes with her, and he sleeps with her. He has no idea that he is sleeping with his daughter-in-law. It's not really incestuous because they're not related by blood, but it is wrong. And anyway, so he is led by her, and he should know better, but anyways he doesn't. And so here she is, and at the end, he said, he goes to give her payment, and he wants to pay her, and she declines. I think it's really interesting. She must have spoken, and they must have had some kind of a conversation, because I'm going to read out the conversation she had. But isn't it amazing that the Lord prevented Judah from recognizing who she was? I think that's also miraculous. Anyways, they've had all this, and they've had this conversation, and she said, what are you going to pay me? And he says, well, I'll send you a kid goat from the flock. I'll send you that. She goes, no, unless you give me a pledge, you maybe won't send it. She's thinking, you're not going to go back to get that. I'm not going to have anything. And he says, well, what kind of a pledge do you want? She knows him. She knows what he has. And she said, well, I want your personal cord and your seal and your staff that you carry all the time. And he willingly handed it all over with her so he could sleep with her. And she got pregnant, it says in the Bible. Then she left and went home. She removed her veil and put her widow's clothes back on. And we think that's the end of the story. There's some significance in what she asked for. She asked for his signet ring, his belt, and his staff. These are really key culturally. This was almost asking for the signet ring. It actually represented the authority of a man. The belt and cord, it almost represented his prestige and who he was. It was a personal item to him. And his staff was, it was like a personal emblem. Sometimes the family lineage was carved into it, and it represented his power, and everybody had a staff. He willingly handed all that over so that he could sleep with her. In today's day, it would be like handing over your driver's license, your passport, your credit card, your birth certificate, your national insurance number. When you lose these things, it's called identity theft. Someone could take that and they could do things with it. And he has handed this over. And he goes on to the sheep shearer. They have a great time. They have a wonderful time. And then he goes back. And he thinks, oh, I must get that kid goat and I must send it back to that prostitute. So in verse 20 again, here comes that great friend of his again. Here comes Hira, and Judah sent the kid goat by his friend Hira to recover the pledge from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He asked the men of the place, where's that prostitute that used to sit by the road? They said, there's never been a prostitute there. He went back to Judah and said, I tried to find her. I took the kid goat. Nobody said they'd seen her. And Judah's like, oh, this is embarrassing. I don't want people to know it's me. Right, just let's cover it over. Let's just forget about it. And let her have it then. If we keep looking, everyone will be poking fun at us. I kept my part of the bargain. I sent the kid goat to retrieve that. It doesn't matter. So he just leaves it like that. 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law has been playing the whore and she's now pregnant. And Judah shouts out, get her out of here. Go and get her and bring her out here. Let's burn her. Amazing. God's watching, God's seeing, and God's seeing all of this. And you know, this is almost the unveiling of Judah. Judah has been veiled. His sins of Joseph have been covered up. His sins of so many different things he's done in his life have been all covered up. And in this incident, God is going to unveil him. God is going to bring it all out into the open. And as they brought her out, I'm just reading verse 25 now, she says, I'm pregnant to the man who owns these things. And she brings out the 3 things, the seal, the cord, and the staff. And immediately it says, Judah saw these and he said, in front of the company of people, she is in the right and I am in the wrong. I wouldn't let her marry my son Shelah. And, you know, in her trickery, in her deception, deceiving him, and God allowing her to get pregnant this way, it has actually brought everything to a head. Judah recognizes, in that statement, he recognizes his sin. He acknowledges his failure as a father-in-law. He confesses to everybody around him what he has done, and he does the right thing. And I just think that's a salvation story just right there. And you know, God in turn looks at her and he acknowledges everything that she has done. And he is with her in the whole journey of her finding you know, her identity, her future, and securing herself. God has said, you know, Tamar, you've been taken advantage of so much. You've been abused. People have done wrong to you, and I want to come and I want to redeem you and I want to restore you. And you know, the other lesson I'd wanted to say is, you know, in her unveiling Judah's sin, it's actually redeemed Judah. And you know, that's what it's like with us. When we come to the Lord with the different issues we have, with the different problems we have, and we lay them down and say, Lord, I don't know what to do. I'm at the end of my rope. I've made a mistake. Something has gone wrong. He loves it when we come to that vulnerable place and he'll say, you know what? It's okay. You're at the perfect place. I forgive you. I love you. I will restore you. And you can have a second start. You can have a third start. You can have a fifth start. It doesn't matter with God. And that's what I think is so beautiful about this. You know, Judah had run away from his family and his faith, and now we see that God uses the consequences of his choice to bring about repentance and restoration, because he is the God of the second chances. And just in summing this story of Tamar back, just summarizing the whole thing, the last lesson I want to learn is God is bigger than any mistakes we can make. He is bigger than any problem we have ever faced, and he can restore and turn our problems and our burdens into blessings. And you know, Judah recognizes this and he chooses to change his DNA. You know, in the next chapter, which we're not going to go into, chapter 39, you see that Judah is instrumental in bringing, you know, in bringing, when he finds out about Joseph, Judah is incredible. Judah becomes a very, very humble man. Judah now is restored, and he realizes his ways, and he says, come on, Tamar, I'm going to be a good man to you. He never ever sleeps with her again. He never dishonors her again. But you know, God doesn't just give her one baby. God gives her 2 babies. God gives her a double blessing. And it says, when the time came forth, she had a baby, and the one baby came out, put his hand out, and then the next one was called Perez. She had 2 children, Perez and Zerah. Perez meant breakout. And I think it's so significant that this child, this incident, was going to break their family apart. It was going to be very significant in opening up and unveiling. There had been too many secrets for too long in this family, and God was going to use this little boy. And this mum and this little boy are directly in the line of Jesus. You know, I love to think that many generations later, there was going to become another person from this line that was going to break out in Bethlehem. And he was going to make a break from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And he was going to break through all the way to Calvary. There was nothing going to stop Jesus going to Calvary for you and for me. And so it's so significant, this story. It's so amazing. You know, the 2 veils, you know, we saw that Leah was veiled, and then she, you know, when her veil was removed, it exposed her brother. And when Tamar's veil was removed, it exposed her father-in-law Judah. But in exposing Judah, it redeemed Judah. You know, Tamar went to live, it's a happy story. Tamar went to live with Judah's family. She raised godly sons, those little boys. You know, Judah went back and he lived with his family. It didn't say they lived in Canaan anymore. Some commentaries say that, you know, maybe Judah then gave Shelah to Tamar, because somewhere it speaks about, and you know, Shelah had a son called but we don't know if that was from Tamar. So there's just dubiety about that. But we just know that he was honorable to Tamar. And she went on, she lived there. I wonder, was she influenced by Leah? Was she influenced by the other wives? She saw, there was something that she was attracted to, that whole culture, that whole God. And I believe that she was someone that was so delighted that God had redeemed her and restored her. He had called her out of Canaan, and he'd called it in a strange way, but God sometimes moves in strange ways. His thoughts and ways are higher than ours. And I love that she is no longer veiled, but she is gloriously unveiled. You know, you look at Matthew chapter 1, and it goes through the genealogy of Jesus, and it says Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had Judah and his brothers. Judah had Perez and Zerah. The mother was Tamar, and Perez had Hezron. I got it wrong there. And you know, I just love that. She's not a mystery. She's not a hidden secret. She is in the Bible. She's not in the Old Testament. She's in the New Testament as well. She is one of the 4 women that's mentioned in Jesus's genealogy. You know, why? I often thought to myself after this story, if I was God, I would have chosen to bring my line through Joseph. Wasn't Joseph a wonderful man? Wasn't he a man of integrity? But God chose a prodigal. God chose a man who had walked away. God chose a deceiver and a manipulator. But isn't that the God we serve? He chooses us. He chooses you and he chooses me. When he could choose so many amazing people, he chooses us. And I just think that's just such a wonderful story. You know, that why Judah, why Tamar? But it's his sovereign plan. And his plan is that all sinners are welcome. Any nationality, no cultural barriers, the lost, the rejected, the hurting, the abused, we're all welcomed and loved by God. I hope you enjoyed the story of Tamar. And go and read it for yourself. It's really good. God bless you and have a wonderful week.